Before I joined the Institute, I was a newspaper reporter for 25 years and worked at the Daily News and the Inquirer. And when I came to the Daily News, a good friend of mine told me to come give Jeremy Nowak a call. He said he's a good guy to know in town. And I spent my life as a reporter writing a lot of tough stories about people. And I'm usually a pretty tough critic on people and don't suffer fools too easily. But I got to say, I can count on my hand the number of people in Philadelphia who I think are honest, straightforward, do the right thing, and don't mess around, and are very successful in this town. Usually those four things, if you try to do them, you don't get to do the fifth in Philadelphia. But I don't know how Jeremy's been able to do that, but he has been, and he's done it with, I wouldn't say grace, but sure force of will and sticking to things. He ran the reinvestment fund before the William Penn folks stole him away. But if you're not familiar with the reinvestment fund, they did a lot of investment in inner city communities, building supermarkets, low-income housing, and charter schools that they've been involved with, and all very successful organizations and things that they've funded. And I was telling Janet Haas on the way over that his joining the William Penn Foundation, they were either making a big statement as a foundation or they did not know what they were getting themselves into. I think it's the former, not the latter. And, out of all the sources and people I've dealt with in Philadelphia, there's very few that I sort of count on as a friend, and I think Jeremy is one of them. And I'm real happy that he's here to come talk to us about debt culture and some of the problems in Philadelphia, because he's seen them up close. So, Jeremy?
Can everybody hear okay? Does this work? Okay. So first, thanks, Paul, and thank you to David from the Institute for American Values and obviously the Templeton Foundation, who've been a big supporter. My colleague and my boss now, Janet Haas. Great to have you here, as well as Jerry Lang from the William Penn Foundation. And it is good to be in one of the houses that Reverend Lusk built. So it's great to be here, Reverend Lusk. And Reverend told me if I do a good enough job, he might have me as a preacher in his church. So I'm going to take him up on it. So we'll see how that goes. I have been following your work at the Institute for American Values for a while. I certainly followed it last year when you brought Thrift Week to Philadelphia. And I really followed it when you hired my friend Paul Davies to do the work on gambling and the problem of the collusion of government and gambling and what it does for working people. And it's, I think, really, really important work, and I really want to applaud you for that. Just one brief note. I know you've got me here as also the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia. That is all true. However, I am not speaking on their behalf. There are many people there right now rolling their eyes going, oh my God, what's he going to say? So I am not. I'm speaking on behalf of my day job here at the William Penn Foundation, so, and not on behalf of the Fed. But it is great to be here. I'm going to talk really about two things. I want to talk about what I see as this kind of project, what it's about, you know, this kind of recovery of the word, the recovery of the idea of thrift, and what I think it is about. And then I want to talk a little bit about how difficult it is, because how counter it is to a kind of dominant culture out there, particularly the dominant culture of debt and what that has meant for our communities and for our nation, and some points about that I think are not usually made. So I just want to talk about that, and then we can have some questions and answers if we have time. And here, I'd just like to say sort of briefly, you know, my academic training was in philosophy and anthropology. It had nothing to do with finance and accounting and business. And that came much later. And in those trades, in anthropology and philosophy, you know, what you do is you use reason to analyze texts, or you use reason to analyze cultures. And, you know, in that world, trying to understand cultural meaning, trying to understand historical meaning, trying to understand texts, language becomes really important, right? The use of language becomes really important. And in many ways, you can kind of plot through changes in a culture, in a society, by looking at the changing meaning of words over time and what words come to represent. And, anybody that doesn't think that, just think about the advertising industry. Think about marketing and advertising. I mean, they really have always got it really clearly about the pliability of language and of words and of meaning, and their ability, very cleverly, to sort of imbue words, imbue slogans with different kinds of meanings. I mean, where else could Coke be the real thing, right? Or where else could madness and love be something about a line of products from Calvin Klein that live between madness and love, right? I mean, so we're sort of surrounded with the kind of redefinition, always, in everything we do, of words and of language. And to some extent, I mean, this has really always struck me in thinking about these questions. And I remember about 25 years ago, I was in South Camden interviewing, some of you probably know Father Doyle, who runs a great parish in South Camden, right? Heart of Camden. I mean, so 25 years ago, I'm interviewing him for something I'm writing, and there you are in the middle of Camden, and here's Father Doyle with this extraordinarily thick Irish accent that I'll try, but I'll blow, right? And we're talking about development, human development, financial development, community development, and he was talking, and the subjects of kind of banking and financial issues came up, and he turned around to me, and in that great brogue of his, he said, thinking about banks, he said, listen to their names. He said, they got names like Trust and Fidelity. They got names like Providence and Citizens and Beneficial. He said, there are words, damn it, we got to take them back. So I mean, I was really like stung. Well, what he was saying to me, I'm sorry for the bad imitation, but I mean, what he was saying to me is that there's a whole sort of language out there, and that some of that language is really our language. It's a language of relationship, it's a language of trust, it's a language of bonds, it's a language of human behavior, and it gets understandably re-represented in other ways, and that we have to be very careful to kind of re-own that language. I mean, it was very clever in thinking about that, and he said it much better than I, but it really struck me, and it struck me in thinking about that, how peculiar so much of modernity is, how peculiar it is that at the very time when the actual bonds of community and trust and relationship become diminished, that those words become commodities. Those words become words that you easily buy and sell. Yet at the very time, the substance of those things is really, not in great shape in many ways, as we see all around us. And as I thought about this, when I was thinking about this talk, it struck me that that's really your project. And that's not an easy project for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about. Your project is the recapture of meaning, right? The recapture of words, the recapture of meaning. And really, like, what the heck does that mean, right? So, think about it. The words that are associated with financial institutions. I mean, think about, if I look out the window here in that direction, I can see PSFS. Right? All you get now is the sign on that signature 1930s building. It was a wonderful old Philadelphia institution. It was the first savings bank in the nation, built, I think, incorporated around 1815, 1816. First savings bank in the nation. It had as its original mission, this is a savings bank, as its original mission was to promote economy and the practice of savings amongst the poor and laboring classes. Who the heck would have thought that was the mission of that bank? When you really sort of think about it, there was an entire history in the 19th century around the construction of saving institutions and credit institutions, credit unions, savings banks, building and loan associations, the smaller local commercial Main Street banks that was really about thrift in the way we think about it, in the way you're trying to retrieve it. It was a set of institutions that we were really, and they were normative institutions. I mean, savings banks in the 19th century like PSFS, would often make certain they were actually created to be different than the emerging commercial banks in the 18th and 19th century. They would actually limit the amount of deposits you could put in because they wanted to make sure it was simply there for low-income people, for poor people, for immigrants, for the laboring classes. It was no different than that extraordinary tradition around the world that America helped create of savings deposits in the postal office system, right? Which was a great thing. I mean, I have some memory of that from being a kid. How many people know, for example, that the first depositor in PSFS was an African-American servant of one of the people who created the bank? That deposit, actually not a small amount of money for the time, was $5. First deposit into PSFS. So your project, which is about bringing back meaning or restoring value, the difficult part of it is not convincing people of the values and of the meaning and the importance. That's difficult enough in the culture that we're in. The really hard part of it is to understand that those things were associated with a set of institutions and a process of institution building that we don't have right now, right? It's simply not in a vacuum, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Look, when I was a kid, and to show you how old I am, I can remember in the 1950s going to elementary school and a banker would show up in the classroom, right? And they would teach you about savings and they would give me this little Scotch book. And like once a month, you would like, yeah, you're old too, just like me. And they would send, and you would send your book up to the classroom, like once a month, and you would like look at each other like who was saving. And it could be a quarter, it could be 50 cents. But you were taught in the classroom that there was something about this that was important. This was in elementary school. This was in the Philadelphia public schools. There was that notion of connection and that notion, those values that we're talking about, the intertwining of those kinds of institutions was still alive in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? It's extraordinary. So part of what you're trying to do is deal with the recapturing of a history that reflects a whole set of very complex institutions that in many ways are not there anymore. That's the tough part of it, right? Now, you know, to be the inheritors of that kind of legacy, which is not represented by institutions anymore, becomes really very difficult. I mean, you know, this is a really different time. If those institutions aren't there anymore, then that means that the reconstitution of thrift is about, in a very different context, the rebuilding of a set of institutions. Now, those institutions may take very, very different forms. We have a different technology, a different demography, a different way that we communicate, different ways that we shop, different ways that we bank, different ways that we connect, different ways that we disconnect. So that kind of institution building, particularly because of the technology, which gives us both advantages and disadvantages, gives us a way to think about the rebuilding of those. By saying what I'm saying, I'm not saying, oh, bring back those institutions. I'm not saying bring back Jimmy Stewart and the Building and Loan from It's a Wonderful Life. I'd like to, but it's over. That kind of thing. We're going to have to bring them back in a different way. It's going to be constituted in a different way. But this is the challenge. The challenge is not just the words, which is challenging enough. Just think, the word thrift. I mean, I never, you know, if I asked my kids thrift, they would think of thrift as stingy, not thrift and generous. They would think thrifty people don't give money away. Instead of thrifty people are people who, because they're good stewards, give more money away, right? We have it inverted, right? We have these things inverted. But the issue isn't just dealing with the inversion of meaning. The issue is building the kind of institutions, the normative institutions, that will allow us to play this out. So I just want to put that. Your project is a really difficult project. And along with lots of other similar kinds of projects, it seems to me that it's as important as any in trying to kind of rebuild an American community, and one that is going to be able to make it in ways that we haven't been able to make it recently. Okay, so I want to just put that on the side, and then I want to get to a second thing. I mean, so it strikes me that you are trying to be one of, and there are others that are also important, one of the kind of counter-narratives to what I think of as a debt culture, a spend and borrow culture, which we have been on for a while, right? I mean, let's face it. We sort of ran up. I mean, you look at the data, you can see the data. You know, in 2008, when the recession hit, it felt like something that happened overnight. Oh my God, it was like a natural disaster. A landslide came down. It was no landslide, it was no natural disaster. There were sort of run-ups to these things over a long period of time. And you can talk about the run-ups in terms of income inequality or income stagnation. You can talk about it in terms of globalization. You can talk about it in terms of a variety of things. But it was also a run-up because of different kinds of institutions and because people were now taking on debt, household debt, in ways that they had never taken it on before. And then when the music stopped, there was nowhere for the debt to go. So you look at the numbers. In the 1980s, if you looked at American debt, I saw this in one of your publications, if you looked at American debt, both household and consumer debt, right, consumer and mortgage debt, which is total household debt, it would be normally, you know, 50, 60% of gross domestic product. By 2007, the point at the end of 2007 when the recession hit, it was 100% of gross domestic product, right? We had substituted, many of us, debt for income in ways that we had never done before, right? We had used leverage. Now, we can talk about why, and that's worth talking about, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this was a big part of what happened. It was a really significant part of what happened in the crisis, and you know, those of us that have worked in low-income neighborhoods, sort of where I met Paul in many ways early on, or where we first started to work with one another, we could kind of see it. We didn't understand the systemic character of it. We didn't understand how bad it was going to be, but we sort of saw it, right? We would be working, Paul, you'll remember, we would be doing studies in the 1990s before any of this stuff hit. And all of a sudden we saw, we did a study at the Reinvestment Fund where we took 13,000 housing units all over the city of Philadelphia, 3,000 random sample, 10,000 that represented, I think, 8 or 9 full census tracts taken from different areas of the city. And then we did what we called an archaeology of debt. We tried to understand over people's lifetime, over a period of time, what was happening with the system of debt. How much debt were they taking on, and what were the institutions that were giving them debt? And we began to see that throughout the 70s and 80s into the 90s, that the world was changing. And all of a sudden, you know, Paul made famous a woman by the name of Veronica Harding, right? She got on the front page of the Daily News. Veronica Harding became the poster person for predatory lending. It was a story that he covered that he almost won a Pulitzer for and should have won a Pulitzer for. And what did we see? We saw you would take somebody like Veronica, and she would live in North Philadelphia in a humble home. And in the 80s, you know, there were no banks in her neighborhood. She would need a loan. She would go to the consumer discount lenders. Sometimes they were downtown. They would give her a $4,000 loan, a $5,000 loan for something. She would take out the loan. She would pay it. It wasn't at the best terms, wasn't at the best cost, but it was what she needed, and that's what she would do. She had no other options. That's how it worked. All of a sudden, a whole new group of lenders emerged that nobody saw coming and actually put out the high-priced consumer discount lenders out of business. It was all of a sudden the subprime mortgage lenders who came into Veronica and said, you don't need $4,000, you need $40,000. We will refinance your house because you also need this, and it'll be cheaper for you. And we'll explain how it'll be cheaper for you. And the next thing you knew, and they had funny names. Sometimes the names of the companies, they were not only the names like the names that I said with Father Doyle. There was one company I remember, she thought it was part of the city. It was called the Philadelphia Gas something, but it wasn't the gas works. She just didn't know. And we would go into house after house after house, and we would look at their documents, and we would say, my God, the world is changing. Something is going on. Now, this was 10 years, 15 years before mortgage foreclosures for the middle class hit the nightly news. The canary in the mine shaft were in low-income neighborhoods. What we did not understand, none of us understood, certainly, that looked at that, was the way in which this was going to happen all over the country, and what we did not understand was the way in which this was going to pose what economists call systemic risk for the financial system itself. we thought we were just looking at somebody named Veronica, right? And that somebody named Veronica, who used to get a small loan from a consumer discount lender, all of a sudden was getting a loan for somebody that could give her the loan because they could now sell it on Wall Street, right? They didn't have to hold the loan. They took the fees. They sold it on Wall Street. And all of a sudden, Veronica was linked to Wall Street in ways that Veronica never understood. And somehow the housing values, which we looked at, looked like they were worth $25,000. Somehow the people who did the appraisals would always get the number that they needed to get, right? And that would go up, and they would create their own market. And we could see this happening, and we interviewed people after people after people, and we talked about it, and everybody thought we were crazy, right? So what happened was, what we were seeing was the beginning of the infusion into the neighborhoods, these kinds of neighborhoods, of a whole new set of institutions. They were subprime housing lenders. They were payday lenders. They were a new breed of pawn shops, sometimes actually like the payday lenders, publicly traded companies who were well organized. They were car title loan companies. They were check cashing agencies, also increasingly public companies. They were casino-related lending operations, tax payment anticipation, loan operations. What we could see was that Main Street was now debt street. It was everywhere. And that if institutions like the reinvestment fund were created because people didn't have access to debt, that was no longer the problem. They had access to debt. They had access to the wrong kind of debt for the wrong reasons. Now, I'm not against debt. I'm a lender, for God's sake. I was a lender for 25 years. I'm against the wrong kind of debt, the debt that is destructive to where the household, the debt that is a substitute for income, the debt that is a substitute for, as I'll talk about in a second, high-quality public and private goods that ought to be delivered in a different way. But what we saw was an infusion of a different kind of, a whole new set of institutions. Look, I'm not being morally against those institutions in the following way. They filled the vacuum. The problem is the other kinds of institutions that I talked about, they were no longer there. The social capital, the institutional infrastructure of savings, the parish credit unions, everything that we think of as sort of building the sort of financial vitality of place, they had disappeared. And a new set of institutions came in, and the new set of institutions was linked to finance in a fundamentally different way than we always understood, which meant that actually people that made the loan were not connected to the asset anymore. They got out fast, that asset went out onto the markets, got sold and bundled and packaged and resold again. And everybody assumed, by the way, that would result in, for finance people, a diffusion of risk. Turned out not so easily, turned out to not be the case. But what we saw was this change, and you could see it in your neighbors. You could see it in the stores that were opening up in strip malls and in shopping centers. You could see it in what was happening on Broad Street. You could see it in how people were behaving. You could see it first with low-income people, but certainly with the middle class, when the home stopped becoming a home and the home became a credit card. And the theory of the home becoming a credit card was that housing values would always rise, and if I have a problem, I can keep flipping around the home, getting more out of it, more out of it, more out of it, until you couldn't, until we get to a place where 20 or 25% of American families are in homes where the mortgage is higher than the amount of debt, than the value of the house itself, are underwater, right? We pushed risk onto households and onto individuals and onto families. This is not to let them off the hook. I'm not talking about big bad institutions and poor, just poor folks. They signed the papers. They knew what they were doing in many instances. And we can all talk about who's to blame. Profligate consumers, rating agencies, and we can build our list here. Patty Hassan, I saw over here from the credit counseling, we could build a good list, right? Of all that, who is to blame up and down from the securitization line down to the brokers to on and on and on. And I've been in more than a few debates about that. But what we have to know is that this was an era that we tolerated that I think will come back again, unfortunately, when every time we went to our mailbox, there were another 5 or 7 credit card applications. I mean, we were overwhelmed by it. I'm starting to see it come back again. It's sort of like worrisome, right? You would get home and you would find out you were so special You had credit that nobody else had. Sometimes they would send you like a load of checks. You ever get the checks in the mail? This is really true. My mother, who died about 5 years ago, so almost 6 years ago now, was in a nursing home. Up in the Northeast. I had taken care of her. She had no assets left. She was in a nursing home, nice place. And they weren't supposed to give the mail to her directly because I had taken over her finances, which no longer existed, right? There was nothing there. Somehow, it gets through to her. So I get a nurse that calls me at TRF and says, Mr. Nowak, your mother is writing out checks. So she was, I mean, God bless her, she was writing out checks to like her grandkids and stuff, and she had no idea what she was doing. She was like, now this is a woman with no credit, no assets, and dementia. She too was given checks in the mail, and it got through the nursing home of where it was going. At that point, I knew like a meltdown, right? Frickin' meltdown, right? And I remember I used to be on the Consumer Advisory Board, Patty, I know was on many, many years ago during the Greenspan era of the Fed. I was in the Consumer Advisory Board. And we would get into these like long arguments about what the font size ought to be in the credit card applications, right? This was what we thought was important. The world at that time, nobody knew it, was coming apart. We were arguing font size, right? If you were on the consumer side like me, you wanted large font size and simple language. If you were on the credit card company size, you wanted small font size because, after all, it would be a waste of paper, and then we'll have to just make it more expensive and turn that, I mean, I could just go on and on and on. Meanwhile, the fucking world was turning upside down, right, as this was going on. Anyway, not that I feel passionate about these things. So it strikes me in looking at this, that when you think about the debt culture and you think about your issue of trying to retrieve your project of retrieving meaning, and your project of retrieving meaning and also trying to understand what's the institutional basis for this retrieval, right? This is not going to be the same. What does it look like, right, for that? What does civil society do? What does the private sector do in response to it? What's the role of the public in response to it? One of the things that struck me the more and more I think about this is a part of a conversation that I think really hasn't been part of the debt crisis conversation, but I think actually gets to some of these issues. It has struck me increasingly that part of the problem, and one of the reasons why people take on lots of costs, and there are lots of reasons, including lots of debt, is because of the degradation of public goods, or because of the high cost of certain private goods that they have to buy for mobility. Right? So let me give you an example, a funny example. I was in Camden, sounds like I hang out in Camden a lot, right? I was in Camden earlier in the week, and actually last week, and I visited, there are 5 remaining Catholic schools in Camden, put together by this Camden partnership. And I interviewed a lot, and they're doing really well. They're doing great stuff. Difficult to try to stay alive, given what's going on with the Archdiocese. And I interviewed in the poorest neighborhoods there are. I mean, North Camden has to be up there among the poorest neighborhoods in urban America. I was interviewing these 4th and 5th grade kids. And they pay tuition-wise $1,000, $1,500, which they can just make. I mean, that's a lot for who these kids are. And the rest gets subsidized by a little bit by the Archdiocese, a little bit by fundraising. And I asked all the kids, and I talked to some of the parents too, I said, why are you here? Like, why are you here? And they pointed to the other district schools down the road, and they said, the violence was too great there. That's what I hear with a lot of kids that go to charter schools. He said, the violence was too great. Now, let's think about what that means. That means that the public good, a school, was so degraded that I had to take on a cost that I might not ordinarily have to take on. Now, it's fine if you want to be free to choose to go to a private school of any kind. That's fine. But what does it mean that we say that? What does it mean? You know, I used to look at these maps that TRF used to build, and I would give them to Paul for his work and his research, and we would look at these maps, and it wasn't the poorest neighborhoods where the highest densities of mortgage foreclosure were. It was the next rung up. Not rich neighborhoods. It was the next rung up. Southwest Philly, lower Northeast, parts of the Northwest. It was the next place. There wasn't enough equity left in North Central Philadelphia. It was the next place. Well, who were those people? They were people that had moved out of the poorest places. They were people who were in search of and willing to take on a mortgage to be in search of a slightly safer place and a slightly, they hoped, better school. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were not right, okay? Look at the debt. Look at the reasons for mortgage foreclosures. In at least 25% of the cases, by some studies, and Patty, you'll tell me whether I have this right, there's something related to a medical expense, either the actual cost of paying for a medical expense or the fact that somebody's now out of work for a medical reason and now can't pay the bills. Is that right, 25, with some of the studies? Right. In other instances, you look at that and you see these other kinds of expenses related to goods like college tuition. We are now at the point, $1 trillion of student loans in America. We have now bypassed the point of credit card debt. We are now, student debt is now higher than credit card debt, okay? Now, what all of these things, schools, safety, high quality transportation, which we could talk about that as an expense and what that means, education, going to college, whether it's community college, state college, whatever, all of these things are the mobility ladders that we assume for working folks, for poor people, for immigrants, for migrants, for working people, for the lower middle class, for the middle class to sustain themselves. And at a certain point, we said that it's okay for them to be, and when I say we, I mean collectively we allowed for the degradation of those goods and said the way to manage that is to opt out in some ways. And the opting out of that often involved taking on more expenses, including debt. Now, I can't prove anything that I just said. I've said this without the benefit of data, my favorite thing to do, right? But I've got a suspicion from talking to an awful lot of people in an awful lot of living rooms and an awful lot of church basements about these issues, that there's something going on here that it would be really interesting to explore. There's something about the interplay of the lack of a certain type of institution, the lack of a certain high-quality public good that has made it so that people in their search for sustainability and mobility have got to take on costs that are added and that we wouldn't have thought were costs they had to take on 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years ago, right? We'll find out. Maybe we'll sometime try to figure that out and try to do a study about it. But so your project, and I'll just wrap up right here, your project is important not because it's a word, but because it represents the retrieval of a whole set of institutions, and at best, I would think, also represents a kind of a critique of where we've gotten in terms of the quality of certain kinds of goods and the necessity of those goods to once again function as what I've termed mobility ladders for the kind of people that I know many of us in this room care about. So let me stop right there. Thank you, and if we have time, I'll take a couple questions. Thank you.